Hello, welcome back to the Terry Nutlove Model Railway Station, a light here for all things model railways. Today we're going to have a quick look at narrow gauge. Let's get started. So here we have a selection of HO scale models, that is to a scale of 1 to 87. On the right here, as you look at it, is a Brauer model of an overhead electric locomotive from Germany. In the middle we have a Bemo overhead electric locomotive. Here is a Rocco Austrian locomotive, and finally on the end to your left is a Rocco Feldbahn or field locomotive. Now, the Brauer engine represents an engine that runs on standard gauge. In the 1-to-1 world, that is 4 foot 8.5 inches. The Bemo locomotive represents an engine that runs in the 1-to-1 scale on meter gauge track, and that translates in a scale of 1 to 87 to 12 millimeters on the gauge of the track it runs on. The Austrian engine represents a prototype that runs on 750 millimeter track, and that runs on N gauge or 9 millimeter gauge track in model form, and so does the other Rocco engine representing a Feldbahn locomotive also running on 9 millimeter track. So let's move this Brauer engine out of the way, because being a standard gauge engine, it's just there to give us a comparison for size. So we'll put this out of the camera shot and we'll concentrate on the narrow gauge engines. So the Bemo, or Bemo as some people call them, engine here, it represents a Swiss locomotive that runs in the 1-to-1 world on meter gauge track, and this in model form runs on a 12 millimeter gauge track. What advantage does this have over standard gauge? Well, as you can see, it's smaller than the HO standard gauge model, and also the trains are much smaller. I'll just give you an example of this by putting a representation of a small train that this locomotive may well pull. So as you can see, we've got the engine, little coach and a wagon, representative of a train from the 1950s or early 60s. And this is the sort of train that would be seen on the Ratishebahn. Not all of the trains were long express trains. In more modern times, the trains have got much longer, but these sort of mixed trains were quite common in the 50s and 60s on the Ratishebahn in Switzerland. And as we can see, comparing it with the standard gauge HO locomotive, the whole train is roughly twice the length of just the locomotive in HO standard gauge. So therefore we can get a much longer train, a greater detail into the same area as we would have with standard gauge. This is the advantage, of course, with narrow gauge. So although meter gauge is very small compared to HO standard gauge, we can actually represent a full mainline running session with the Ratishebahn, because they have express trains, they have very heavy goods trains, and if you represent the modern era, you have container trains, everything that you see on the standard gauge railway, but running simply on a meter gauge track. A lot of the railway system is single line, and therefore in modelling terms, it gives us great advantage in the fact we don't have to represent a double track system. There's fantastic scenery we can represent in Switzerland with viaducts going straight into the sheer face of a cliff, all sorts of bridges and viaducts and snow tunnels, avalanche protection systems. Everything can be modelled that you wouldn't see on English railways or railways possibly in Belgium or France. Apart from Germany, in Bavaria, it's something that is pretty unique to Switzerland and Austria. So scenic wise, the Ratishebahn, and indeed all Swiss model railways give us a great advantage for spectacular scenery. Add this to the smaller size of the trains, and there's already an advantage over standard gauge. Of course, you can always have the meter gauge railway running with a standard gauge, and there are many examples in Europe where meter gauge and standard gauge not only interchange but actually share the same track. And Tillig produce dual gauge track in HO standard gauge and meter gauge, and HO standard gauge and 9mm or 750mm in the real world, where the twin tracks run together on the same line, i.e. there are just 3 running rails, a common rail, and then a rail for the standard gauge and a rail for the narrow gauge. You could get points, crossovers, all sorts of things, and it's all available from Tillig. So maybe you want to check that out. So the last 2 engines to look at are this Rocco Austrian engine. Now, these engines in model form can only go round a radius of about 13 inches. Because they're articulated, there's not a great deal of movement, and it is an 080 format on the engine with a tender, although in actual fact the real engine isn't a tender engine. It's only articulated in model form to allow it to be more flexible in use. In reality, the whole engine is built on one solid frame. However, it's not to be confused with some of the smaller narrow gauge engines that can go round very tight radiuses. So the advantages again with this are that you can run shorter trains more realistically with just 3 or 4 coaches and be prototypical. You can get quite a large railway into a small space where the standard gauge HO wouldn't fit. And of course, when we get down to 9mm track, we're talking the same as 009 is in the UK. We can use all the standard buildings, all the kits that are available both in HO and 00, whether it be 009 or an HOE railway. And all of these kits are available, all the scenic items are available, and they'll all be to the correct scale. The only advantage we get in here is, of course, we can cram a lot more in track-wise. We can go around tighter radiuses. And finally, with this little Rocco field barn engine, this is designed to be running on the same 9mm track, but it can go around a radius as tight as 100mm. It can cope with very, very tight turns, and the little wagons that it pulls, representing hoppers or flat wagons that would be used to move stuff about in a field railway or a temporary railway in a factory, are very small indeed. We can actually incorporate a whole train and have the whole train no longer than 6 inches long. So these small engines really are great if we want to have a very compact small diorama. And the big advantage with all of the narrow gauge items is that you can compress things down, you can compress the radius of the track down, and therefore what would be a limited space for possibly just an end-to-end layout in HO standard gauge can now become a complete circular roundy type layout in HOM or HOE, certainly in HOE. All we have to bear in mind is that larger engines such as this won't cope with really tight radius curves. These little engines can go around virtually anything you want to do. The Ratishebahn models can represent the same operation as a main line, yet again in a smaller space. And of course you can incorporate all of this, be it 009 or HOE or HOM, into your existing railway. So they go side by side with standard gauge models. You can have anything you want, and yet again, as I've said so many times on this channel, everything goes together. All you have to do is make a start. So this was just a little chat about narrow gauge. I think narrow gauge shouldn't be overlooked when you're looking into model railways. It's something that you can add later to your model railway that exists already. And it's also something that can be a standalone model railway by itself. There's a lot of interest in narrow gauge. It's worth considering when you're thinking of moving on, changing a scale, or adding something new to your existing railway. As always, all of this is supplied by me. There's no sponsors, there's no finance arrangements with anyone. I don't get any monetization from YouTube. All I ask is that you like and subscribe. If you like it, of course, hit the notification bell, and that causes the algorithm to spread this channel out amongst people like yourself that like to see model railways. So all that's left to say, yet again, usual catchphrase, nice one. I'll see you next time.